There was an article that was published by The Atlantic. It was on the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. And the name of the article is called Why the Most Educated People in America Fall for Anti-Semitic Lies. And I just want to share with you guys some things. So there has been a phenomenon in the United States that's been going on for a number of years now, and it has really increased since the war in Gaza that began on October the 7th, and that's a very, very controversial issue. So Israel started bombing Gaza, and people really started openly hating Jews. It became more open. And now you hear stories about people urinating outside of Jewish events, harassing Jewish students, assaulting Jews. There was one case in Los Angeles where a man broke into a Jewish family's home and he was screaming death to the Jews. There was some guy in a university who sprayed a very terribly smelling substance onto Jewish students, and he was screaming gas the Jews as he was spraying them. There was one case in Arizona where a Muslim student murdered a professor because he thought that the professor was Jewish, even though the professor was not Jewish, but even if he was, obviously that doesn't justify killing him. So you have all these events. But even before the war broke out, you saw this sort of thing happening. It wasn't as common as what we see now since the war began. There was a synagogue in Pennsylvania that was shot up. People were murdered. There was a synagogue in California that was shot up. Both of these terrorist attacks were done by neo-Nazis. And I've noticed this, and I've talked about this a number of times on this stream. I remember coming home one afternoon. To this day, I remember it. It was a very surreal experience because I had never experienced anything like it. I literally came to my home one afternoon only to see a pamphlet on my front yard. I picked up the pamphlet and it had straight up neo-Nazi, anti-Jewish propaganda on it. I am not joking when I say this. I am not exaggerating when I say this. My heart started racing. You know why my heart started racing? Because people have mistaken me for being Jewish. And I was thinking that somebody was singling me out and was harassing me. And that's a very scary feeling when somebody harasses you, especially in your home. That's horrifying experience. That's kind of the reason why I wish I don't become famous. I never really want to become a super famous streamer because I know that when you become a famous streamer, that's the risk that you face. And I remember speaking to a neighbor of mine and I said, hey, I got this pamphlet. Did you get this pamphlet? And he said no. And that made me even more worried because then I thought, okay, it's not a guy who's passing pamphlets on every house. Why my home? I called up the police force, and the lady who picked up the phone, the police officer who picked up the phone, I told her what happened, and she said, do you want us to send an officer to you? I said, no, don't send an officer here. I don't want to make a huge deal about it. I said, I just want to ask you if you've gotten any reports about anti-Jewish brochures on people's homes. And she said, no. She said, but I will tell you, the local synagogue here has to have a police officer or multiple officers present because she says they get death threats every single day. I said every day. She said every single day they're getting death threats. And this happened in 2022. I looked it up on Google if somebody was getting these brochures, and sure enough, there were articles online talking about how people across America were getting the same brochures. So there's a network of people in America who hate Jews, and they are spreading this stuff. They're spreading this ideology. And I had never seen anything like that in my life. What was scary is that a few days later, I went out and the same brochure was on my yard again. And that shit really just messed with my head, I'll be honest with you guys. So the October the 7th massacre happened. Israel started bombing Gaza. Boom, 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 boom. All of a sudden you saw a 1 million man march in London. Huge marches in Greece, Australia, the United States. So what's happening? What's happening is that Jew hatred is becoming mainstream. I've said this many times, and I've written a very long article on the next Holocaust and why it will happen. It's called The Extermination of the Semitic Race. My dad and I worked on it for months on and off. It's on shoebot.com. It's right in the top. You'll see it. So in this article that was published on The Atlantic about the rise of anti-Semitism, it says, in Congress, all 3 university presidents offered some version of the platitudes that hatred comes from ignorance and education is the answer. But if hatred comes from ignorance, why were America's best universities full of this very specific ignorance? And why were so many people trying to justify it? By justify it, she's talking about justifying hatred against Jews. Explain it away or even deny it. Our era's 10-second news cycle is no match for these questions because the answers are deep and ancient, buried beneath the oldest of assumptions about what we think we know. These lies range in scope from conspiracy theories to Holocaust denial to the blood libel to the currently popular claims that Zionism is racism, that Jews are settler colonialists, and that Jewish civilization isn't indigenous to the land of Israel. These lies are all part of the foundational big lie that anti-Semitism itself is a righteous act of resistance against evil because Jews are collectively evil and have no right to exist. Today, the big lie is winning. And that last line is what got me to want to quote it to you guys, to read it to you guys. Today, the big lie, meaning Jew hatred, is winning. Here's the thing, is that Israel is right to want to destroy Hamas. Is it sad that Gazans are dying? Yes, it is. But who's at fault ultimately here? Hamas is at fault ultimately here because Hamas knows that its people live in a very populated, densely populated area, and that if any war happens in Gaza, you're going to have a very high death rate. But the death rate is much higher now than prior wars. And that could be because Israel is killing more Hamas operatives. Israel has stated that they've killed around 10,000 or so Hamas operatives so far. Israel has said that it wants to just wipe Hamas out. Whether that's going to happen, we will see. I don't know. It's a very intense bombing campaign that Israel has been doing. More and more people hate Israel. I think what's going to happen is, and I could be wrong about this, but I suspect that Trump is going to win. I suspect that Trump is going to win, and that Trump is going to tell the Israelis just to basically do what it wants to do what they want to do. And maybe some kind of a negotiation will happen, and there will be a ceasefire, which will ultimately be broken, like they always are. But I think that the Trump administration, because the Biden administration has been more critical of Israel. But I think if you have a Trump administration, it'll be much more lenient towards Israel, because Trump is probably the most pro-Israel president that we've ever had, or one of the most pro-Israel presidents, very pro-Israel. In fact, when Trump was president, Israel was talking about annexing 30% of the West Bank, and the Trump administration was heavily for it. Many people in the Trump administration were heavily for it. But if you have a Trump presidency, Trump will be very lenient towards the Israelis, and then the Israelis will have more of a green light. It'll have more of a sense of empowerment. America eventually, I think, is just going to clean its hands of Israel. I think eventually the world is going to isolate Israel to the point where Israel is going to have nothing to restrain it. And one thing that we know about Israel, one thing that we know about the Jewish people looking at their history, is that when there is no restraint, there's a tremendous amount of bloodshed. And of course, you can say this about any people. During the Roman-Jewish War, the Judeans revolted against Roman rule, and there was anarchy amongst the Jews. And they butchered each other like chickens. There was no restraint. Do you know why there was a famine in Israel during the Civil War, during the Roman-Judean War? People say, oh, there was a famine, people were starving, etc., etc. Do you know why people starved during the Roman-Judean War? It's because the Jewish factions that were warring with each other hated each other so much that they said, let's destroy each other's granaries so that we'll starve each other. One of us is going to surrender to the other side. So they would say, we hate that other side. We hate that Pharisaical side. So let's destroy their granaries and starve them. And they did this so much in Israel that there was starvation. There were women who would bake their infants in ovens, and they were committing cannibalism. So there was a demonic spirit that hit Israel. And what do we see in Israel today? We see this rise in fanaticism. And I know I've been pro-Israel, but I am not naive to the reality of Israel. I am not naive to the fact that there is a huge problem in Israel with racism and fanaticism. And I know very well the Israeli soldiers of today are not the same makeup as the Israeli soldiers of the past. The Israeli soldiers of the past, in the 70s and the 60s, were much more restrained. They were much more temperate than the soldiers of today. The Israelis of the past were more civil. The Israelis of the past were more balanced, I think, in their views. And today, the balance has declined tremendously, and fanaticism is eclipsing reason. And so you have these fanatics in Israel who hate Arabs. They hate Christians. They hate non-Jews. And they want to make Israel into a pure Jewish state. They want to make Israel into a puritanical state, and they want to kill all the Christians, or they want to get rid of them somehow. They want to destroy all the churches. They want to burn down all the churches. That Gopstein guy, who's a part of the Jewish Power Party in Israel, he said that he wants to burn down all the churches in Israel. And he said that he is willing to spend 50 years in prison just to burn down and destroy all the churches in Israel. Let's not forget the very spirit that crucified Christ. The spirit that crucified Christ was that of the Sanhedrin. These weren't pagans. These were not atheists. These weren't secularists. These were right-wing, far-right, fanatical Judeans who murdered Jesus. And the very mentality, the very spirit that possessed those who murdered Christ is alive and well in the soul of Israel. Fanaticism is taking the place of reason. And there are people in Israel who know this. And that's why you have demonstrations. That's why you've had demonstrations against the Netanyahu government. Because the Netanyahu government wants to overhaul the Supreme Court. They want to get rid of the Supreme Court. They want to weaken the Supreme Court to the point where the Knesset has full power and the Supreme Court is diminished to the point where it has no influence, and the Knesset can pass laws that are fanatical, that are evil, that are tyrannical, without the Supreme Court canceling it out. There is a danger to democracy. People don't talk about this. Americans love to talk about the importance of democracy and blah, blah, blah. But there's a reason why we have a Supreme Court. The reason why we have a Supreme Court is to put a check against democracy. Do you see what I mean? It's to put a check against democracy, because democracy can be very dangerous. What happens when people want to vote for something evil and tyrannical? Well, you have judges, and the judges are, in a way, they are above the mob. They're above the masses. And so the judges say, well, this law is unjust. This law is unconstitutional. This law encroaches on people's liberties. Got to cancel it out. And that's why you have a Supreme Court. If you have no Supreme Court, then the people rule, the majority will always win. And that's when you have the tyranny of the majority. And that's what the fanatics in Israel want. They want the tyranny of the majority. And that's why they want to weaken the Supreme Court. And that's why you had literally 5% of Israel's population taking part in demonstrations against the Knesset, against the Likud coalition in Israel, because that's how dire the situation is over there. So you have these people who want to make Israel into the next Sanhedrin. They want to bring back the Sanhedrin that killed Christ. My father even told me that when he was growing up in Israel, he talked to Israeli soldiers. He was always around Israeli soldiers because my father lived under the Israeli occupation. And my father told me that the soldiers were, for the most part, very friendly people. But now you're seeing a change. And now what's happening is that because so many soldiers are fighting in Gaza, now what they're doing is they're taking settlers, they're recruiting settlers to become soldiers, and they're putting those people in the West Bank to patrol the West Bank. And you have Palestinians who are saying, well, the soldiers right now are not as friendly as the other soldiers. The friendly soldiers, they were all sent to the front. They were all sent to Gaza. Now they're recruiting the settlers, and they're putting the settlers in the West Bank, and these soldiers are abusive. These soldiers are sadistic. These soldiers are mischievous. And so Palestinians are saying, well, the soldiers they had in the past were a lot friendlier. What's going on? What's going on is they're putting the fanatics in the West Bank. And I've said this before, and I really believe this. The goal of Israel, ultimately the goal of Israel, is to take Gaza. There's an event, a modern day event, that nationalist Israelis have never forgotten. And that is the event of, it's called Gush Katif. Gush Katif was a settlement, a Jewish settlement in Gaza. It had about 8,000 or so Israelis living in it. And to make peace with the Palestinians, the Israelis made a concession. And they said, okay, let's get rid of Gush Katif and let's force all the settlers out of Gaza. So they removed all the settlers out of Gaza. Now, who were amongst those who wanted to remove Gush Katif? Amongst those who wanted to remove Gush Katif were the people who lived in the kibbutzes on the Israeli-Gaza border. They wanted Gush Katif to be removed because they believed that by removing Gush Katif, there would be better relations between the Jews and the Palestinians. So when Gush Katif was destroyed and the people were forced out, the Jews were forced out, the Jews of the kibbutzes were clapping their hands. And I say that figuratively and literally. They were people clapping their hands. Why? Because they believed that it was those settlers who were a part of the problem. Who was massacred on October the 7th? Kibbutzim. People in the kibbutzes who were living on the Israeli border. The people who were pro-Palestine. The people who are against the settlers. Those were the ones who were butchered. The Palestinians literally butchered their friends. That's one of the saddest realities, one of the saddest facts about the October the 7th massacre. It's that the people who were murdered on the October 7th massacre were the friends of the Palestinians. They were very pro-Palestine, and they were the ones who were butchered by the Palestinians. So, what type of argument did that leave for the nationalist? The argument now is, this is why you don't trust Arabs. The kibbutzim trusted them, and look what happened. They got butchered. See? Can't trust an Arab. So racism is going to increase. Hatred against Arab people has obviously increased. And Israel has always had a very intense environment, and that atmosphere of tension has only gotten worse, and it's only going to get worse. The boiler pot is increasing in intensity. What's happening? What's happening is you have racism against Arabs increasing, but you also have racism against Jews increasing. And eventually this is all going to just implode into a bloodbath. I believe that you're going to see the revival of Nazism in the Western world. I believe that you're going to have another regime that would be a descendant of the Third Reich. And I believe you're going to have another Holocaust. That's what's going to happen. So I'll read to you guys some more excerpts from this article. In a Dallas suburb, teenagers told me, shrugging about how their friends, Jewish fraternities at Texas colleges, have been chalked. I had to ask what chalking meant. Anti-Semitic graffiti made by vandals who lacked spray paint. Synagogues are often chalked too. Another newly common verb among American Jews is swatting, fake bomb or active shooter threats that force evacuations and instill fear. The term is a reference to the SWAT teams that sometimes arrive at the scene, not knowing the threat is a hoax, and instill more fear. These now happen so often at American Jewish institutions that they're almost boring. Nearly 200 were swatted during one December 2023 weekend alone. The problem was not that Jewish students on American university campuses didn't want free speech or that they didn't want to hear criticism of Israel. Instead, they didn't want people vandalizing Jewish students' organizations' buildings or breaking or urinating on the building's windows. They didn't want people tearing their mezuzahs down from their dorm room doors. They didn't want their college instructors spouting anti-Semitic lies and humiliating them in class. They didn't want their posters defaced with Hitler caricatures or their dorm windows plastered with "fuck Jews." They didn't want people punching them in the face or beating them with a stick or threatening them with death for being Jewish. At world-class American colleges and universities, all of this happened and more. So there is a hatred to the Jews in the Western world, and it is increasing. That's what's happening. People don't expect these things to happen. That's the thing. That's the thing, guys. People don't expect this sort of thing to take place, right? So we think, okay, there's some people who hate Jews. Jew haters are a minority. There's not really a lot of them. They're in the fringe. Nobody really cares. Neo-Nazis are fringe. So who cares about what some lunatics have to say? Just ignore them because they are insignificant, right? This is the very, very common mentality that people have. And when the Nazis rise up, people are shocked. And this is why a lot of people have difficulty believing that Ukraine has a Nazi problem. A lot of people have difficulty believing that. They just can't believe it because they think Nazism is a thing of the past. It's like in that interview between Tucker Carlson and Putin. Tucker Carlson told Putin, well, Hitler's been dead for 80 years, and Nazism is in the grave, so why are you talking about denazifying Ukraine? Putin looked visibly upset when Tucker Carlson asked this question, and Putin said, if Nazism is dead, then why in the hell do you see the leader of Canada giving an applause, clapping his hands for an old Ukrainian Nazi who's a murderer in the Canadian Parliament? Why do you see that? Because it's not dead, right? It's still here.
The Canadian Parliament introduced a man who, as the Speaker of the Parliament said, fought against the Russians during the World War II. Well, who fought against the Russians during the World War II? Hitler and his accomplices. It turned out that this man served in the SS troops. He personally killed Russians, Poles, and Jews. The SS troops consisted of Ukrainian nationalists who did this dirty work. The President of Ukraine stood up with the entire Parliament of Canada and applauded this man. How can this be imagined? The President of Ukraine himself, by the way, is a Jew by nationality.
Really, my question is, what do you do about it? I mean, Hitler's been dead for 80 years. Nazi Germany no longer exists. And so, true. And so, I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism. But how? How do you do that?
Послушайте меня. Ваш вопрос очень тонкий.
Listen to me. Your question is very subtle, and I can tell you what I think. Do not take offense.
Of course.
Он, казалось бы, тонкий. Он очень противный, этот вопрос.
This question appears to be subtle. It is quite pesky.
Значит,
You say Hitler has been dead for so many years, 80 years. But his example lives on. People who exterminated Jews, Russians, and Poles are alive. And the current president of today's Ukraine applauds him in the Canadian Parliament. gives a standing ovation. Can we say that we have completely uprooted this ideology if what we see is happening today? That is what denazification is in our understanding. We have to get rid of those people who maintain this concept and support this practice and try to preserve it. That is what denazification is.
People can't believe that there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine. And you can give them all the facts. You can say, well, look at the national heroes of Ukraine. Look at Bandera. Look at Shukovich. Look at Melnik. Look at Nikola Lebed. Look at all these national heroes in Ukraine. Why are these people all Nazis? Why were these people all Nazi collaborators? Why would your national heroes be Nazi collaborators? That's problematic. The problem with people is that they understate the thing that is both obvious and serious, and they overstate how normal everything is going to be. If someone says, hey, there's a serious problem here, what's going on? This is getting really scary. People always say what? Oh, they're just some lunatics. Oh, they're just fringe. Oh, they're just crazy people. Oh, they're insignificant. And why do people say that? They always make these types of comments when a dangerous trend is growing. Because as the trend is growing, it still appears small to most people. But here's the problem is, if you're only going to give attention to a problem when it's a serious problem, then you're part of the problem. It's like waiting for the tumor to reach stage 4 before you get to the hospital. No. You should go to the hospital when the tumor is in its latent stage, because that way it's easier to get rid of the problem. But if I say, look, there's some Jew hatred here. Look, there's more cases of Jew hatred increasing. Look, there's more hatred. There's more cases of racism increasing. Look, there's fanaticism that's increasing. Look, there's nationalist fanaticism that's increasing. Oh no, that's all fringe. It's all small, but it's growing. And you're only going to focus on the problem. If you're only going to focus on a problem when it becomes serious, then that particular problem that you ignored for all those years is only going to come back in the future, because you're only going to focus on it when it becomes a problem. That means it can return, it can spread its propaganda, it can propagate itself, it can advance itself, and it can thus become a big problem again, because you're going to ignore it until it becomes a big problem. The solution to the big problem is much more dire. It takes wars to remove this type of problem. And that's basically how people fought when the Nazis first took power. When the Nazis were rising up to power, and when they took power initially, people downplayed the reality of Nazism. So, for example, I've been reading this book here. It's called The Third Reich by Michael Burleigh, and he talks about how people downplayed the seriousness of Nazism when it first happened. So he writes here, optimists felt that matters would stabilize with Hitler destined for the dustbin of history. So people thought, oh, this Hitler guy, his fate is going to be the dustbin of history. Nobody's going to care about this guy. He's just a raving buffoon. That's what a lot of people thought. So it says here, one could also delude oneself that constitutional norms still prevailed, and that one was still living in the Reichsstaat that Jews had once helped to create, or that Nazi violence was the product of malign individuals. In other words, these Nazis are just crazy people. We still have a constitution that protects our rights. So what are we worried about? And this is how people downplayed the reality of Nazism. And people are going to make the same mistake in the future. There was also a natural human tendency to believe in a disparity between rhetoric and policy. Or, as the saying went, the bark was worse than the bite. So people have this idea that, well, yes, they're fanatics, but their rhetoric is just rhetoric. Their rhetoric cannot be applied as policy. And again, people think like this today. Well, yeah, they're fanatics, but we have to separate their words from their actual policy. So therefore, they're not dangerous because their rhetoric is not going to actually materialize. And this is another problem that people make. And then here's another thing that this historian writes. Across the country, offensive slogans were daubed on walls and shop windows with arrows painted on the pavements indicating Jewish business premises. Signs reading Jews not wanted here were strung across streets or displayed in the windows of bars, cafes, and shops. And you see this sort of thing today in universities. It's probably not as explicit as this, but you see a sign of it. You see a version of this in universities today where they, like the article from The Atlantic says, they will harass Jewish students, they will harass Jewish clubs, they will urinate on the buildings of Jewish clubs or the buildings where Jews congregate. So you see this sort of thing. Effigies of Jews were kicked to pieces or burned in the streets. And the thing is that not everybody hated Jews in Germany. Not everybody was a Nazi. You had people who had no issue with Jews. You had Germans plenty of Germans actually, who didn't like what the Nazis were doing. They were against what the Nazis were doing. The presence of those people did not make much of a difference because the genocide still went on. The reason why is because enough people believed in the Nazis. If you have, it's not that you need everyone to believe in a particular ideology to make it dangerous. It's simply that you just need enough people to believe in an ideology to make it dangerous. Just enough people. And that's all that the Nazis needed. And what do we see today? We see people making excuses for Ukrainian fascism. We saw that in 2022. We see people making excuses for what Hamas did on October the 7th. We see people expressing hatred against Jewish people because of what's happening in Gaza. And we also see Jewish people hating non-Jews in Israel. And the Jew haters, they reference that. They reference racism in Israel. And they say, you see how the Israelis are. You see how Jewish people are. The Jews hate the Goyim. They hate non-Jews. And all of this is going to just continue to increase. And it's gonna build up like a boiler, like a pressure cooker. And eventually you're going to have another Holocaust. I've said this many times and I'll continue saying this. You're going to have another Holocaust. It's going to happen, guys. Why am I so confident? Because look at history. It's happened numerous times. Many times, actually, this has happened. The Holocaust was the biggest example, but it happened before that. You had pogroms in Eastern Europe. You had pogroms in Western Europe. And so the Holocaust was it was the biggest example, and it was the biggest accumulation of that type of hatred. But the difference between Nazism and the type of stuff that happened before that in Europe was that Nazism would use science, it would use mainstream racist science to justify its actions.